Welcome back. Ontario is the latest province set to ease COVID-19 restrictions Tuesday. But we're taking baby steps compared to the U.S., where almost every state has partially reopened. Everything from restaurants to beaches, barbers, even Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort is allowing guests back this weekend.
We need to be safe. We're not sure really. The stats on everything seem to be conflicting sometimes. So
it's a sense of happiness for a lot of people, just to get back and see old friends again.
I wouldn't go to a gym at this point because there's too much sweating and breathing heavy and all that stuff.
But here's the thing, when it comes to COVID-19, it really is America first. The U.S. has the highest official case count in the world with over 88,000 lives lost. Compare that to Canada with more than 5,600 COVID casualties. And America's outbreak is expected to get a lot worse. There's a patchwork of rules in place to stop the spread, but there are still new outbreaks in places like Nashville and Des Moines, so more people will likely die. And Canada is expected to announce this week that our border with the U.S. will stay closed for a while yet, but how worried should we be about our neighbor next door? Joining me now from Toronto is Robin Urbach. She's a Globe and Mail columnist. And joining us from Washington is David Frum. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic and author of Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. So David, I'm going to start with you. There's a recent poll suggests Canadians are a lot more nervous about Americans bringing COVID-19 across the border than vice versa. So does it make sense to you that Canadians are scared with the U.S. numbers so high and so many close to our border?
President Trump imagines the viruses as like tiny little illegal aliens that you can sort of block from coming across the border. The border is open. When you say the border is closed, the border is closed to non-essential individual personal travel. But billions of dollars of goods are flowing across the border all the time on trucks and trains, and services are being, even in this depressed economy, the border is open to many, many kinds of activity, just not individual, personal, inessential travel. And that is not going to keep out viruses. I mean, viruses move in all kinds of complex ways. And so so yes, of course, Canadians are concerned about what's going on in the United States, but it's not just that you're going to get infected by a disease. What is going on in the United States is a risk to a whole vast global system of security and commerce that everybody benefits from. And you can't, and just as Donald Trump is living in fantasy land when he imagines that the United States can wall itself off from the planet, Canada, an even more global country, would be engaged in even greater fantasy if it imagined it could wall itself off.
So, Robin, we've seen now that President Trump has appointed this sort of Operation Warp Speed to try and find a vaccine. He says by the fall, most of the scientists are saying that's not possible. But I mean, I guess we could end up being dependent on them for if they get a vaccine and we want access to it. I mean, it is a rather complicated relationship.
We could. I mean, Canada is already conducting its own research. It's underway, for example, at the University of Saskatchewan right now, developing a made-in-Canada vaccine. We've also partnered with a Chinese firm, which of course comes with its own complications, but that firm is entering into the second phase of human clinical trials, and that might actually be conducted in Canada. So should that prove to be successful, Canada will have an in there in terms of a vaccine. So we're not fully dependent on the U.S., but I think we want to be careful there too. I mean, as to David's point, of course, there's still transport going in and out of Canada to the U.S. back and forth. We've maintained trade of essential goods and services as we've had to. But opening the border to non-essential travelers, normally this time of year, if this was a year ago, we'd see something like 2 million Americans coming into Canada over the course of a month. And every one of them potentially could bring with them the virus. So the whole point of travel restrictions is not to create an iron wall that will stop the transmission of virus back and forth, but basically it's to siphon it down, to slow it down, to try and get a hold of the situation and to slow the transmission of that virus into Canada. So of course there's still risk with the border right now, but opening the border up even more, particularly before we have the capacity to track and trace, will absolutely make the situation much more difficult for ourselves. And that's the danger that Canada is in, frankly, from the United States. That's where we got sick from primarily to begin with, and that's where we risk a second wave from when and if we loosen restrictions.
There's been a very different approach, David. You've written about it in terms of how Justin Trudeau, other Canadian leaders have approached this versus Donald Trump. You have infectious disease experts like Anthony Fauci saying, a vaccine could take a year and a half, maybe don't reopen too quickly. And yet he's saying push ahead. Like there was the tweet just a few days ago that you picked up on of Trump saying good numbers coming out of the states that are opening. America's getting its life back. The vaccine is looking very promising before the end of the year. A spin, perhaps?
It's flim-flam. I mean, Donald Trump is a huckster and always has been. But he is making a calculation that is rational in its brutality. What Donald Trump has decided is that the pandemic will not defeat him for re-election. Remember, more and more and more of the casualties are being suffered by people from poorer people, ethnic minorities, people who he dismisses as not his voters. What is weighing on his voters is the economic burden. The collapse of retail sales, down 15% almost in the month of April. Clothing sales just collapsing by almost 90%. So what Donald Trump has decided, I am prepared to risk more sickness and death among people who don't vote for me in an effort to boost the economy for people who do vote for me.
But I wonder what kind of a strain does that put on the relationship with Canada, Robin, because the approach here has been so different. We have these negotiations now to figure out whether the border will be reopened or not. We don't know what's happening, but it's a very different approach. What does that do to our relationship?
Well, I think our relationship, frankly, has been strained for as long as this president has really been around. But I think there's also a danger, too, in just watching the way America is opening up from a Canadian perspective. We look at the American experience and we compare it to our own. So I think there's a cultural danger almost in watching what's happening in the U.S., watching the loosening of restrictions happening in the U.S., and seeing that sort of ignite and reignite feelings of restlessness within Canada. We have seen some copycat protests in terms of loosening up stay-at-home orders in Canada, not with the sort of vigorance that we've seen in the U.S., but they have been here. And I think there's a danger really in watching what's happening in the U.S., seeing those anxieties and the restlessness sort of apply to Canada as well.
So much to watch for as both our countries reopen to different extents. Thank you both for talking to me today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Robin Urbach in Toronto and David Frum in Washington. The Weekly continues right after this. We are coming to you from downtown Toronto. It's looking a little different these days.